The origins of aggressive atheism. And Dr. Craig, a lot of the characteristics of the new atheism can be characterized as very aggressive, very in your face, and so on. And there's a new book out on it. You and I have not read it yet, but we're going to look at an article that mentions this. It's called Atheist Awakening, and it's from Oxford University Press. The Atlantic has an article from Emma Green about the origins of this more aggressive form of atheism. Article begins, American faith has gone through many awakenings. Depending on how you count, there have been 3 or 4 distinctive surges of Protestant religiosity in the United States, marked by tent revivals, missionary work, widespread conversions, and often intense rhetoric about the consequences of sin. These great awakenings have been memorialized through texts like Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, a sermon delivered by Jonathan Edwards in 1741, who warned of the fire of wrath and hell. One thing about the great awakenings, Bill, many are saying we're ready for that next great awakening. Now, I'd like to suggest that this renaissance of Christian philosophy and apologetics could be leading to that, if not considered a real awakening. Because what's it going to look like? I mean, we don't have as many tent revivals and things like that. We have social media, the internet, and conferences and things. And so perhaps.
Yeah, this is what Alex McFarland has said. He thinks that this renaissance of Christian apologetics could well lead to a sort of revival in the church. And I have to say, I have seen this happen over and over again in the lives of men.
Especially men.
Especially men who have been lukewarm in their faith or perhaps even disinterested and come into contact with this material, and their lives are changed. Because once they believe firmly that this is really the truth, they get excited about it and about sharing it with others. And
I like the way you put it, electrified.
Yes, that's very true. And we get letters from these grateful wives about the transformation they've seen in the lives of their husbands or fiancés. And so that is a very, very encouraging sign. I had never anticipated that apologetics would have not merely intellectual effects upon people, but that it would also have profound spiritual effects in reviving the soul.
And ladies, you're not off the hook. Come on in. In fact, we're reading an article here written by a woman from the Atlantic. So she said, so in light of all that, it's provocative to title your book Atheist Awakening, Oxford University Press's newest release on non-belief by researchers Richard Semino and Christopher Smith. It claims to be the first sociological exploration of organized secularism in America, tracing the evolution of the atheist community over the past several decades. The awakening part is not so much a growth in numbers as an awakening to claiming atheism for themselves and becoming more public about it, said Semino. By numbers alone, American atheists really aren't that big of a group. Let me back up before we go there. Bill, there has been an atheist pride. It's no longer, everything is about coming out of the closet these days, about wearing it on your sleeve. Wear your atheist t-shirt, your bumper sticker, you're loud, you're proud, you know, and the whole thing, and trying to change the public persona. For so long, it was just represented by Madalyn Murray O'Hair. She was the face of atheism, and she was the most hated woman in America. Now, we as believers in Christ are not to be hating her, but she just got pinned that, and she earned a lot of it with the way she was. By numbers alone, American atheists really aren't that big of a group. According to a 2012 Pew report, atheists make up only about 2.4% of the population. Wow. Even agnostics, whom you would maybe call atheistic-ish, only account for an estimated 3.3% of Americans. Although both groups have grown somewhat since 2007, the bigger change has been among those who identify as nothing in particular, roughly 13.9% of the population, which is an increase of 2.3 percentage points over 5 years.
That is the lowest percentage estimate I've seen of the nones in the literature, only 13.9%.
N-O-N-E-S, nuns.
Yes.
Yeah. And you've pointed out as well something she's saying here. When you read headlines about the rise of the so-called nuns, or people who don't consider themselves part of a religion, that's what they're mostly referring to, the shruggers. They might be intensely spiritual or perfectly apathetic about faith, but for some reason or another, they don't self-identify as definitively atheistic. Very important. They could even be churchgoers,
right,
Christians, evangelicals. They don't prefer to characterize themselves with any particular denomination. We've seen kind of a lowering of denominationalism.
So atheism, according to these results, remains a relatively small percent of the American population, but I think that it indicates that Richard Dawkins has been largely successful in his effort to elevate the profile of atheism, to have atheists come out of the closet and to publicly proclaim their non-belief without shame or embarrassment. And it does seem to me that there has been a large cultural shift in that respect, which I think can be to the credit of the new atheist efforts.
Okay. Among those who identify as atheists, though, the tone taken toward organized religion, especially recently, has been more shouty than shruggy. At the 2012 Reason rally in Washington, D.C., for example, a band fired up the crowd with a rousing song that lampooned the belief in Jesus coming again, mixing it with sexual innuendo, Cimino and Smith wrote. Attendees sported T-shirts and signs with slogans like "I prefer facts," and there was a life-size Jesus puppet and things like that. This wasn't just one small enclave meeting for some drinks and Judeo-Christian trash talk. There were between 8,000 and 20,000 people there. Nobody really got a full range, but that's kind of a puzzlingly wide range of estimates, she says. But still, it was in the thousands. Richard Dawkins, one of the keynote speakers, encouraged attendees to ridicule people's faith. Not all atheists take this tone toward faith, but it's a somewhat common posture, especially among some of atheism's most vocal advocates, including Dawkins and people like P.Z. Myers and Bill Maher. Well, Bill, another hallmark of the new atheist, not only loud and proud, wear the T-shirts and the bumper stickers and in your face, but for too long, dialogue, they think, and they could be right about this to an extent, has been thwarted because you weren't supposed to discuss religion in polite company. Don't discuss politics or religion. And religion was off limits in polite society, public in general, for criticism. Why? Because it was just seen as personal taste, and not necessarily as truth. Now they're saying if you're going to make any headway against religion, which they want to do, you've got to ridicule it.
Yes, I don't see this as an effort to engage in dialogue, quite the opposite. These folks aren't interested in dialogue. And that is why ridicule, mockery, insult are their modus operandi. It isn't an effort to have serious dialogue. And if you want to see this on display, look at the quote-unquote dialogue I had with Lawrence Krauss in Brisbane,
Perfect
Australia.
Example.
It was not, in any sense, a dialogue. It was a rant and a personal sort of attack. So this is part of the subculture, these authors are saying, that characterizes this group of people.
Yeah, and this book says this. It's definitely one of their strategies, said Cimino. There is this strong attempt to be kind of irreverent. This is a quality particular to New Atheism, he said, a term for Dawkins-style arguments against faith, which rely heavily on science and invocations of rationalism. There's a sense that once you make fun of it, you can kind of demystify religion. Well, Bill, what do you think about that? Once you make fun of it, you can demystify it.
This was a strategy that was used in the deist controversy in Britain and in Europe that I came into contact with when I was doing my research on the historical argument for the resurrection of Jesus. The deists, I think, rightly understood that one of their most potent weapons was not intellectual interaction with the views of Christians, but just mockery and ridicule and humor. And unfortunately, Kevin, these are very, very potent weapons, I think, in the hands of unbelievers. So this is an interesting strategy that they're deliberately adopting that we know has worked in the past, and it remains to be seen whether it will work this time around. I get the sense among many people who are more cultured that they're a little bit tired now of this mockery and ridicule, and that the so-called new atheism is beginning to show itself to be pretty intellectually thin. But unfortunately, there's ample evidence in the internet subculture and on the popular level that this way of approaching religious questions is still far, far too common. Don't engage intellectually with it, just mock and ridicule and speak condescendingly of it.
And that's different than, say, reductio absurdum, isn't it? What would be the difference between mocking something and reducing it to the absurd?
Well, in a reductio ad absurdum argument, you try to show that your opponent's view, if true, will lead to a contradiction or some sort of an incoherence, and therefore is self-defeating. But that's very different than just name-calling and ridiculing those who disagree with you as mental midgets or as bad people. That's a totally, the one is an argumentative strategy, whereas the other one is more of a rhetorical strategy, I think. Christopher Hitchens was very gifted rhetorically in the way he would attack Christianity, but I was frankly appalled at the lack of substance in his arguments. He had almost no acquaintance with theistic arguments or the historical credibility of the Gospels. All he could do was mock and ridicule.
Yeah. What do we do, Bill, whenever someone got this memo? Because I think the memo has been circulated that you're supposed to be derisive in order to demystify. What do we do in the face of that? I mean, what we'll often cry is persecution. I don't think we in America know what a persecution is.
No.
What we call persecution is some guy in his basement sending us a flaming email. That's not persecution.
No.
You know.
No, not when we see what's happening in
No.
Syria and Iraq today and the Christians who are
Or in history, yeah.
being persecuted there. But in responding to this, I think this requires an enormous amount of sensitivity on the part of the Christian to know whether to try to answer the question in a serious way or whether to simply say to the person, if I were to answer that question, would you really then be ready to become a Christian? And if the answer is no, say, I don't sense that you're really sincerely seeking the truth about God. You just want to argue and to ridicule, and I've got better things to do with that, so I don't care to talk about this further. And I think there comes a point at which you follow Jesus' advice to not throw your pearls before swine, lest they turn to attack you and trample them underfoot. There is a point at which it's simply counterproductive and fruitless to engage in conversation with a person like this. Now, as I say, This requires sensitivity to know when you are talking to a person like this, and where perhaps by giving a good answer to the face value question, you might take him aback and perhaps pull the rug from under his feet, and he suddenly sees that, well, gosh, there really is a good answer to what I thought was a knockdown objection. So you've got to be careful and to play it by ear in dealing with folks like this.
Bill, what do you think of this observation? I've looked at hundreds of videos and listened to audio preparing for these podcasts and in my own ministry and apologetic work. And I go through a lot of atheistic and skeptical videos, and you'll see them, so many of them now being very derisive toward God, calling God a moral monster, and then, you know, and spelling God with a small g and things like that. But you know what is still relatively rare is an attack on Jesus. Now, there are some there.
Yes.
There are. And even at this Reason rally, they had a big puppet of, you know, Jesus and things like that. But that's still relatively rare. And that says something about the character of Christ, for one thing, but it also says something about the character of the people who do. If you can do that, if you can make fun of him in some of the ways I've seen, you are really off the deep, one is really off the deep end. You really have gone off the deep end as far as I'm concerned. You are in severe danger at that point. Now, I don't mind saying that, because that is really an indication of something profound.
Yeah. Jesus himself is, in a sense, his best defense. If we can just get the unbeliever to read the Gospels about the life of Jesus, I think there's tremendous attraction in the person of Jesus in terms of the authenticity of his life, his courage in the face of death, his convictions and uncompromising message for what he believed in. I think getting folks to read the life of Jesus and to think about it themselves is a very powerful witness to them, more than just arguments that we might give.